hopefully what you guys all do know is what fiscal policy is. It's, of course, a demand-side policy that involves changes in government spending or taxes. But of course, you already know that. It's easy stuff. And therefore, quick answers in the chat, please. Quick like lightning. What is a fiscal deficit? Hopefully, you know this. You can express this with 2 letters and a mathematical symbol. Okay, that's all you need. 2 letters and a mathematical symbol. What is a fiscal deficit? Sharp as a knife in the chat, please. Do me a favor today. I'm high energy. I need some stimulation, guys. So let me turn my floor light. Ooh, there we go. Sit. No fatigue. Okay. All right. I live with it. All right. So yes, Niati. Yes. Okay. Niati has told us G is greater than T. Right. This is a fiscal deficit, and it's a mathematical expression, right? What do we mean? Government spending could be, say, 21 billion, i.e., the amount the government spends in a year or a month, or whatever, is 21 billion. Tax revenue they receive, well, if G is greater than T, maybe they're earning 19 billion through tax revenue, so they've got a fiscal deficit, in this case, of minus 2 billion. Okay, so a fiscal deficit occurs when they spent more than they're earning in tax, and this isn't the same thing as national debt, but it's effectively what causes national debt. So what exactly is national debt then? Obviously, it relates to fiscal policy, it relates to this concept of a fiscal deficit. So I think a really good, easy, tight definition of national debt is that national debt is, well, let's say, refers to a government's accumulated fiscal deficits. And you might be thinking, wait, I thought you said that as you got a really nice, easy, watertight definition here. What is this accumulated fiscal deficits concept? It's really simple. Let's say year 1, year 2, we're looking at the fiscal position, the deficit or surplus of a given economy in a given time period. So let's say the fiscal position, which is whether they have a deficit or surplus, and the value of that in year 1 is minus 10 billion. So they had a deficit of 10 billion. In year 2, maybe, let's say their spending increased by 2 billion and their taxes stayed the same, in which case their deficit would rise to 12 billion. And then let's say in year 3, brought down the deficit a bit, maybe they decided to increase taxes. And then in year 4, let's give them a surplus of 3 billion. Okay, so the accumulated fiscal deficit on the national debt is literally, if we imagine this is the first year this government starts operating, well, they've spent 10 billion more than they made in year 1, so they will have to borrow to cover their fiscal deficit, and that's where national debt comes from. So they will have to borrow. They'll have to borrow 10 billion to cover their fiscal deficit, and they will now owe someone 10 billion. We're going to ignore interest here, so we'll assume it's interest free. Anyone, again, quick in the chat? Some people in the waiting room. Any idea what would the total national debt be after year 2 here? You had a deficit, you had to borrow 10 billion in the first year. How much are you going to have to borrow in the second year? And then what's your overall debt going to be in year 2? Anybody? Nice again, quick. Yes, Niati, my chat here. You are going to have 22 billion of national debt, right? Because you had to borrow 10 billion to cover your too much spending, not enough revenue in year 1, and then you had to borrow 12 billion to cover your deficit in year 2. So again, ignoring interest, total debt after 2 years in government, it's going to be 22 billion. Year 3 should have all got the idea by now, I hope. Yeah. Okay. What the next step for you, Niati, is to answer it before I even ask the question. Yes. Um, Devak, I'll come to your question at the end. Good question. We have national debt therefore increasing by 9 billion. Now, can anyone work out what is going to happen to national debt in year 4 here, where I've been a bit tricky and I've given them a surplus of 3 billion? So a couple of people have said 34 billion. They are incorrect. I have tricked them. I'm very happy with myself. Devak, oh yes, well done, well done. A couple of people have corrected themselves. It is going to be 28 billion. Good. So, and that is because if you have a surplus, you've made more tax revenue than you are spending as the government, which means you have extra money to pay off your debt. So if you spend too much money, you need to borrow. If you make extra money, that's your surplus, you can pay off this national debt. Okay. So basically, fiscal deficit, national debt goes up. Notice that's happening here. Fiscal deficit 3 years in a row, national debt goes up 3 years in a row. Fiscal surplus, national debt goes down. Okay, so that's the basics of this relationship. Okay. If you want a macro analogy, it's very well, it's not very similar. It's exactly the same in a way as total and marginal. The fiscal deficit or surplus is the government's position for just the last year or quarter or month or whatever, like that. That is what marginal is, right? And then total is the accumulated marginals. It's exactly the same concept with, say, like marginal revenue and total revenue. If your marginal revenue is 5, your total revenue goes up by 5. If your fiscal position is -5, the national debt goes up by 5. So very, very similar mathematically, and it is also correct to say that much like the marginal is the gradient of the total, this is going to have the same relationship with this, and you can see that, right? If fiscal position changes by 12, the national debt changes by 12. Or sorry, if the fiscal position is -12 or +12, the national debt would change by 12. So it's effectively the same thing. It's just that you have an inverse mathematical relationship rather than positive. So you've got marginal revenue positive, total revenue goes up. In this case, it's if the marginal is negative, the total goes up. But other than that exception, it's exactly the same logic. So, okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now I'll come to Devak's question, which was, doesn't the national debt have anything to do with imports, exports, things like this? So the answer to that is no. And this is the second part I wanted to consider today anyway. So hopefully you're all happy with this sort of explanation. Copy it down. It's very easy to understand if you need a reminder. I'll keep it up for a bit. But what I want to do next is kind of like, what is the difference between national debt and other types of debt? Which is basically what Devak's question is about, right? He's saying, is it to do with exports and imports? And like I said, no. So we've got the national debt, private debt / consumer debt, which is sometimes interchangeable and sometimes not interchangeable, and we have external debt. Okay, so national debt is it's a weird name because it is not actually the whole nation's debt, like everyone in the country. It is just the government's debt. Okay, and I get that is confusing, but it's not complicated. Whilst it's confusing, it's not complicated. National debt really just means government debt. So when we use the term national debt, we do not mean everyone in the nation. We just mean the government's debt, which relates entirely to fiscal policy. So if I go into debt, say on a mortgage, UK national debt does not increase. If the government borrows money to cover a fiscal deficit, UK national debt increases. The reason for this is just because the government in effect is representing the nation in international financial markets. Like when we say the UK government's debt, that is sort of like the state's debt, and the state is the nation. So it's again, you don't need to worry about that anyway. It's not complicated. National debt really just means government debt. Um, Public or consumer, sorry, private or consumer debt, as opposed to public debt, which is really what national debt is the sort of the everyday people's debt, right? My debt, your debt, etc., etc. If we take out loans, blah blah blah. This is not typically a focus of questions on debt at A level. They have, I think, for both AQA and EdXL, they have done one maybe question on private or consumer debt, maybe two in like 10, 12 years. So definitely not a big focus. And I didn't plan to talk about it a lot today, and I'm not going to. But the kind of problems like high consumer debt creates is like housing crises if people can't pay off their mortgages, and they have to basically sell the house to try and cover as much of the mortgage as possible, and that can depress the housing market, and people just keep losing money. You will have less spending in the economy because if consumers are trying to pay off their debts, they're not going to be able to spend as much. So the problems with private debt are not too complicated. So again, this not a big focus for us now. External debt, this is what they're like was talking about. So external debt relates to imports, exports, currencies, current account deficits, far more complicated and arguably a lot more problematic. And this is actually one of the evaluations we will come to later when we discuss whether debt, national debt is a problem. So external debt, I would argue, is more of a problem than national debt. So we'll get into that later. But again, this one relates to exports, imports, currencies, current account. This one does not.